The sun was beginning its descent over the quiet suburban neighborhood, casting long shadows across the rows of perfectly manicured lawns. The houses were the picture of order, each one reflecting the strict regulations of the Homeowners Association, HOA. But for Tom Carter, it wasn't just the pristine neighborhood that kept his days predictable. It was the constant pressure from the HOA, particularly from the notorious HOA Karen Evelyn Matthews. Tom had lived in the same house for over a decade. It was modest but well kept, with a spacious two-car garage and a yard that, though not as immaculate as the others, was always presentable. His pride and joy, however, wasn't his lawn. It was the vintage Jeep parked securely in the garage. He'd bought it years ago, restoring it from a rusted hunk of metal into a pristine, off-road monster. It wasn't just a vehicle. It was a symbol of his hard work and love for adventure. But it had become more than that. It was a target. The tension had been brewing for months, ever since the HOA had started cracking down on what they deemed unapproved modifications to homes in the neighborhood. Evelyn Matthews, the self-proclaimed queen of the HOA, had become the enforcer of their rules. She took her job too seriously. Some might even say she took pleasure in it. Her most recent complaints had been about Tom's garage. According to her, his Jeep was unsightly, and in her words, unfit for a neighborhood that prided itself on curb appeal. She had made it clear in her letters, phone calls, and passive-aggressive encounters that she expected him to either get rid of the vehicle or, at the very least, park it out of sight. But Tom wasn't the type to bow down to someone like Evelyn. He was a man of principle, someone who believed in standing his ground, especially when it came to his property. The Jeep was a part of his identity, and he wasn't about to let her dictate how he lived his life. Every time he received a letter from the HOA, he'd shove it into his desk drawer, shaking his head at the absurdity. He had no intention of complying with Evelyn's demands, but the mounting pressure was starting to take a toll. She had a way of making everything seem like a personal attack, and her influence within the HOA made it difficult for Tom to ignore her. Today, though, something felt different. Tom had a nagging feeling that Evelyn wasn't just going to let this go. She'd been quieter than usual lately, and he couldn't shake the suspicion that she was planning something. The kind of thing that would cross a line, something he wouldn't be able to brush off with a sarcastic comment or an ignored letter. As the wind rustled through the trees, Tom glanced at his garage. The Jeep sat there, gleaming under the fading sunlight. Little did he know that very Jeep was about to become the focal point of a much bigger battle, and Evelyn Matthews, with all her cunning and authority, was ready to make her move. Hey, real quick, if you're enjoying the video so far, make sure to hit that like button, share it with friends, and subscribe for more awesome content. And while you're at it, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. All right, let's keep going. Evelyn Matthews had always considered herself the unofficial guardian of her neighborhood. In her mind, the HOA rules weren't just guidelines. They were laws, sacred principles that had to be obeyed without question. She took it upon herself to ensure that everyone followed these rules to the letter, even if it meant stepping on a few toes. To her, the well-being of the HOA community rested squarely on her shoulders. Of course, no one had elected her for this position, but Evelyn didn't believe in democracy when it came to maintaining order. No, she was the self-appointed queen, the enforcer, and she was proud of it. Her obsession with control started innocently enough. At first, it was just a few complaints about overgrown hedges or fences that needed repainting. But over the years, her influence had grown. She'd become the go-to person for anything HOA related, and she made sure everyone knew it. People feared her. They knew that a simple violation of the rules could lead to a fine, a public reprimand, or worse, a prolonged battle that could make life unbearable. And Evelyn thrived on that fear. She didn't just want compliance, she wanted power. But lately, it seemed like one person had become immune to her rule, Tom Carter. His disregard for her numerous letters, his refusal to move his Jeep, his defiant attitude whenever she showed up at his door, Evelyn could not stand it. Tom was different. He didn't cower in front of her, and he certainly didn't bend to her will. That infuriated Evelyn more than anything. She had tried everything, dropped hints, sent warning letters, even had a friendly chat about the community's aesthetic. Nothing worked. Tom's Jeep was still parked in that garage, defying her control, taunting her. But Evelyn wasn't about to give up. If anything, her determination had only grown stronger. She could no longer afford to let this one man ruin her perfect vision of a pristine, compliant neighborhood. And so, she began to formulate a plan. One that would not only force Tom to comply, but would also teach him a lesson he wouldn't soon forget. The key to her plan lay in the Jeep itself. Evelyn knew Tom's attachment to the vehicle. He would never get rid of it voluntarily. But what if she made it impossible for him to keep it? She didn't have the authority to just demand he get rid of the Jeep, but Evelyn had learned through years of manipulating the system that there were always loopholes, always ways to get what she wanted. So, she put her mind to work. One afternoon, as she was making her routine rounds, she noticed Tom's Jeep was parked unusually close to the edge of his driveway, the garage door slightly ajar. She watched from her window, observing the vehicle's position as if it were a chess piece on a board. That's when it clicked. If she could get her hands on the Jeep, she could make it disappear. Tom would have no choice but to tow it, and, once it was gone, he'd be forced to comply with her demands, or risk losing everything. It was a perfect plan. Evelyn wasn't one to leave things to chance. She began to gather information. Over the next few days, she subtly watched Tom, learning his schedule. She noticed when he left for work, when he came home, and most importantly, when the garage door was left open long enough for her to slip inside unnoticed. She also knew that Tom's garage was often filled with clutter. He was a collector, always working on something new. The Jeep itself was tucked in the back corner, out of view unless you took the time to look. Perfect. No one would notice if she tampered with it. Her plan was coming together. Evelyn didn't just want the Jeep out of the picture. She wanted to break Tom. If she could take his pride and joy, his one source of comfort in a world of HOA rules and regulations, it would send a message to him and to everyone else in the neighborhood. Her dominance would be absolute. There would be no one left who dared to challenge her authority. The next step was clear. She would strike when Tom was away on one of his long shifts, when he least expected it. She'd sneak into his garage, cut the lock, and take the Jeep. It would be the perfect crime. And once it was gone, she could either drive it away or make sure it was taken somewhere that would make its return impossible. After all, what could one man do against the combined might of the HOA? With her plan set in motion, Evelyn's sense of excitement began to build. She could already picture the look on Tom's face when he discovered his beloved Jeep was missing. It would be the perfect moment of triumph, the final victory in her battle to bend everyone in the neighborhood to her will. And no one, not even Tom, could stop her. It was a crisp evening when Evelyn Matthews decided it was time to put her plan into action. The sun had set, casting an eerie glow over the quiet neighborhood, and the streets were bathed in the soft orange hue of the streetlights. Most of the neighbors were tucked inside, enjoying their evening routines, completely unaware that one of them was about to make a decision that would change everything. Evelyn waited until she was certain Tom was away, his truck long gone down the street for his evening shift. The coast was clear. She pulled her black sedan into a nearby alleyway, making sure not to attract any attention. She had been watching Tom's house for days, noting the exact times he left and when the garage door was left ajar. Tonight was the night she'd finally get what she wanted, Tom's prized Jeep. She parked a few houses down, her heart beating with a mixture of excitement and nervous tension. Evelyn was a woman who rarely felt fear. Control was her weapon, and tonight she was wielding it like a sword. She grabbed the toolkit she'd hidden in her car, carefully slipped out of the vehicle, and made her way toward Tom's property. Her shoes barely made a sound on the paved driveway as she approached the garage. The familiar smell of the freshly mowed lawn filled the air, mingling with the sharp scent of the night. Everything was perfect. The garage door was slightly open, just as she had hoped. The Jeep, as always, was tucked in the back, almost hidden behind the piles of tools and boxes that cluttered Tom's workspace. She'd seen it before, the dull sheen of the green exterior, the rugged tires that made it look like it was ready to tear through the wilderness. But tonight, it would be gone, and Tom would be none the wiser. Evelyn crouched down beside the garage door, pulling a bolt cutter from the bag. The lock was old, rusted. Tom had always been too busy to replace it. She grinned, the excitement building within her as she slipped the large jaws of the cutter around the lock. The sharp snap of the lock breaking echoed in the quiet night, making her jump slightly, but she quickly regained her composure. It was done. The garage was open, and the Jeep was hers for the taking. Her hands were shaking as she approached the vehicle. She'd done this before, of course, only with much smaller stakes. But this was different. This wasn't just a simple theft. This was the culmination of months of frustration and a deep, unshakable desire to reclaim control. She knew Tom would be furious when he found out, if he ever found out. He'd never be able to prove it was her. She'd make sure of that. What Evelyn didn't know, however, was that the Jeep was more than just a vehicle to Tom. It had become a pawn in a much larger game, one that was about to bring consequences, far beyond what she could have imagined. Beneath the gleaming surface of the vehicle, there was more than just an engine and wheels. There was a carefully orchestrated plan set in motion by the local police task force. Tom's Jeep had been tapped as part of an undercover operation involving the local law enforcement. Unbeknownst to Evelyn, it had been fitted with tracking devices and hidden cameras, all meant to monitor an ongoing investigation. The task force had been following it for weeks, keeping a close eye on its every movement, and they were already watching. As Evelyn reached for the door handle, her fingers brushed against the cold metal. Her heart raced, not from fear, but from the thrill of it all. She was so close. In her mind, she could already hear the sound of the Jeep's engine roaring to life as she drove it out of the garage, ready to disappear into the night. But the reality was far from what she expected. From a nearby tree, high above her, a small red light blinked unnoticed. A camera mounted on a branch, one of several strategically placed around the property. A few miles away, in a darkened van, a team of officers watched every move Evelyn made. They were patient, waiting for her to make the mistake that would seal her fate. She didn't know it yet, but Evelyn was being watched, every step, every breath. The tension was palpable, thick enough to choke on. Evelyn's hands were now on the Jeep's door, her eyes darting around nervously, as if expecting someone to catch her in the act. She was so close to her goal, but the silence around her only amplified the tension, making it feel like every sound, every movement could be her undoing. If only she knew how close she was to the point of no return. The consequences were already set in motion. Her actions, driven by a need to control, would soon lead to a reckoning she wasn't prepared for, and it was only a matter of time before the police task force made their move. Evelyn Matthews had no idea how wrong she was, or how this simple act of theft would unravel everything she thought she knew about power. As Evelyn Matthews was about to slip behind the wheel of the Jeep, a sudden sharp vibration startled her. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. For a moment, she thought it was just the normal texts or emails she often ignored, but then a glance at the screen made her stomach drop. It was a notification from an app she'd never seen before, one of those generic security apps that Tom Carter had probably set up himself, but she had no time to ponder it. She was already so close, and her heart beat faster with anticipation. Her hands hovered over the keys as she read the text. Alert. Garage. Movement detected. Someone is accessing the vehicle. Her breath caught in her throat. She immediately began to scramble for an explanation, her mind racing. Had Tom come home early? No, he wouldn't be back for another couple of hours. Could someone else have triggered the alert? But the garage was empty, or so she thought. She glanced over her shoulder nervously, then quickly brushed it off. This was nothing. Just a glitch, a false alarm. With renewed determination, she reached for the door handle of the Jeep again, but something was off. She couldn't quite place it. A subtle shift in the air, a faint sound in the distance that made her pause. Her instincts, the ones she usually relied on to stay ahead of the game, were suddenly screaming at her. Something wasn't right, but she was too far in, too close to her goal to back out now. She'd come all this way. There was no turning back. Meanwhile, in the dimly lit control room of a nearby police task force unit, the tension was escalating. A group of officers sat hunched over a bank of monitors, their eyes glued to the live feed from the cameras installed on Tom's Jeep. What Evelyn didn't know was that the vehicle wasn't just a prized possession to Tom, it was the centerpiece of an ongoing operation. The Jeep had been under surveillance for weeks, part of a carefully orchestrated sting involving the local police, and Evelyn had just walked right into the heart of it. Detective Mark Hargrove, a seasoned investigator with years of experience, under his belt, watched the screen with a mix of disbelief and confusion. The Jeep had just been accessed. No, not just accessed. It had been tampered with. The motion sensors had picked up a figure moving around the vehicle, a shadow that seemed too familiar. They had expected this moment, but not like this. "Is that her?" Officer Claire Monroe asked, squinting at the screen. Hargrove nodded, his jaw tightening. "It's her. Evelyn Matthews, the HOA Karen. I've seen her around before. She's always been a pain in the ass for Carter, but this is something else." They had been tracking the Jeep for weeks, but up until now it had been a simple surveillance operation, just keeping tabs on an individual of interest. They hadn't expected someone like Evelyn to get involved. She wasn't part of the criminal underworld or involved in any illegal activities. She wasn't supposed to be a threat. But there she was, cutting a lock off a garage door with the precision of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. The officers exchanged worried glances. "Do we move in now?" Claire asked, her hand hovering over the radio. Hargrove hesitated for a moment, then gave a sharp nod. "No, we need to wait for confirmation. She could just be snooping around. If we act too soon, we risk spooking her and losing the opportunity to get real evidence." In that moment, as Evelyn prepared to start the Jeep's engine, the officers in the van watched her every move, ready to move in at a moment's notice. The tension was palpable. Every second that passed felt like an eternity. Back at Tom's house, Evelyn was growing increasingly uneasy. The notification had only been the beginning of her anxiety. She felt an odd pressure in the air, a tightening in her chest, but pushed it aside. She twisted the Jeep's ignition key, the engine roaring to life. The hum of the powerful motor filled her ears, and for a moment, she allowed herself to feel the rush of victory. The Jeep was almost hers. Just a few more minutes, and she'd be gone. But as she shifted the vehicle into gear, a loud, authoritative voice echoed from the street, cutting through the silence of the night. "Drop the keys. Step away from the vehicle?" Evelyn froze, her eyes wide with panic. She hadn't heard the approaching sirens, hadn't seen the flashing lights that were now reflecting off the walls of the neighboring houses. In that split second, it became clear that this wasn't just a random patrol. This was a coordinated effort, something much bigger than her simple theft. She looked around in a daze, wondering how she had missed the police closing in. Before she could react, several officers stormed onto the property, their badges flashing in the glow of the streetlights. The world around Evelyn seemed to slow, her mind scrambling to understand what was happening. She hadn't planned for this. She had been so sure she could pull this off without anyone noticing. But now, with her back against the wall, she realized just how wrong she had been. Meanwhile, inside the van, Detective Hargrove watched with a mix of relief and disbelief as the operation unfolded. His fingers tightened around the edge of the monitor, his breath slow and steady. They had caught her in the act. The tension that had hung in the air was finally broken, but not without consequences. And as the officers took Evelyn into custody, it was clear that the unexpected had just become the beginning of something much bigger. Tom Carter had dealt with his fair share of HOA drama over the years. Passive-aggressive notes, arbitrary citations, for excessively blue recycling bins, and Karen's endless complaints about unauthorized lawn ornaments. But tonight was different. The notification on his phone jolted him mid-dinner like a thunderclap. He stared at it for a second longer than most would, processing what it meant. Garage breached. Motion detected near Jeep. His heart skipped. That Jeep wasn't just a vehicle. It was wired into an active police investigation, one he was cooperating with due to a former acquaintance now under watch. And now someone was tampering with it? He stood so fast, his chair screeched backward across the hardwood. Without thinking, Tom grabbed his keys, shoved his phone into his pocket, and sprinted toward the front door. But before stepping outside, he paused just long enough to dial Detective Hargrove. "She's doing it," Tom said breathlessly when the call connected. "Karen, she's in my garage, trying to steal the Jeep." "Stay put," came Hargrove's calm yet urgent reply. "We've got eyes on her. Do not approach. Do you understand, Tom?" But Tom wasn't wired to stay idle while someone pried into his life, especially not Karen, the nosy, power-hungry woman who thought HOA regulations gave her divine rights. Ignoring protocol, he stepped outside and made a beeline for his neighbor's driveway across the street. As he moved, he tapped on a few house doors along the way, alerting longtime neighbors and friends, people who were also tired of Karen's antics. Within minutes, a small cluster had formed under the glow of the porch lights, concerned faces, phones out, whispering and watching. Meanwhile, inside the garage, Karen had finally unlocked the Jeep's steering column, grinning smugly. As she eased into the driver's seat, the plush leather, the smell of motor oil, and something faintly citrusy, it was intoxicating. In her mind, this was justice. Tom had violated HOA policies one too many times, and this vehicle was, in her warped worldview, evidence of some deeper, criminal activity. "This will teach him," she muttered, sliding her oversized sunglasses onto her head even though it was well past dusk. "Bet he thinks twice before leaving it unlocked next time." She never saw the flashing lights in her rearview mirror. Outside, Tom could barely contain his frustration. Every instinct screamed at him to run up, pull her out of the car, and demand answers. But he had to hold back. The Jeep wasn't just his car anymore. It was part of something bigger. Still, watching her ease it into reverse like she owned it made his blood boil. "Seriously? She's actually trying to drive it off?" one of the neighbors whispered, phone camera recording steadily. Tom nodded grimly. "She has no idea what she's gotten herself into." Suddenly, the screech of tires sliced through the air as two unmarked vehicles sped onto the street, headlights blazing. Officers poured out, shouting commands. Karen froze, her hands in the air, eyes wide behind her tinted lenses. It took her several seconds to process that the shouting wasn't from Tom or the neighbors. It was from men in tactical vests with badges. She was being treated like a real suspect, because, well, she was. Tom stood a few feet away, arms crossed, jaw clenched. He wasn't smug. He wasn't even angry anymore, just exhausted. He'd been dealing with this woman for years, brushing off her little power plays and petty control games. But this was theft, tampering with police property. It was beyond neighborhood squabbles. As the officers cuffed Karen, gently but firmly, and began reading her rights, Tom exhaled for the first time in minutes. Neighbors murmured among themselves, some audibly shocked, others not at all surprised. And somewhere in the midst of all that tension, a tiny flicker of vindication sparked in Tom's chest. Finally, someone else saw what he'd known all along. Karen had gone way too far. Karen had always believed she was the smartest person on any block. Her HOA title gave her a false sense of jurisdiction, as if every inch of the neighborhood was her personal chessboard. But tonight, her queenly facade began to crack. As the red and blue lights pulsed against her windshield, the reality she'd never prepared for began to close in. Step out of the vehicle with your hands up. An officer's voice boomed through a megaphone, calm but commanding. At first, Karen didn't move. She sat frozen in the Jeep's driver's seat, eyes wide behind her now slanted sunglasses. Her mind spun in circles, unable to connect the dots. This had to be a mistake, some kind of ridiculous misunderstanding. After all, she wasn't a criminal. She was just taking action, taking initiative, in the name of neighborhood order. Right? But outside the garage, the scene said otherwise. 3. Unmarked SUVs had blocked off the driveway and part of the street, headlights forming a white-hot wall. Officers moved in tight formation, weapons holstered but hands ready, eyes scanning for any sudden movement. Behind them, neighbors had begun to gather in clusters, murmuring in disbelief, phones aimed like they were live streaming an episode of their very own true crime series. Tom stood just behind the officers, his arms crossed tightly against his chest. His jaw twitched with restrained emotion, not just anger, but the pressure of everything building to this moment. He had known Karen was relentless, but this level of intrusion? This was her jumping head first off the edge of reason. He exchanged a quick glance with Detective Hargrove, who gave him a silent nod of assurance. Inside the Jeep, Karen's breath came in short, sharp gasps. Her fingers trembled on the steering wheel. She couldn't even remember why she'd wanted the Jeep in the first place. Her original plan, whatever it had been, was now buried beneath. A mountain of adrenaline and fear. Suddenly she fumbled for the gear shift. "Don't do it, ma'am," one of the officers shouted. "Put your hands where we can see them. That vehicle is part of an active police investigation." Karen froze again. "Police investigation?" she murmured, confused, then louder to the officers. "Wait, I didn't know. I thought it was just an illegally stored vehicle." "I was going to move it for safety! I'm the HOA president!" The crowd erupted in a low wave of laughter and gasps. Tom couldn't help but scoff. Hargrove stepped forward now, his voice firm but even. "Ma'am, step out of the vehicle! You are trespassing on private property and interfering with a federal operation. This is your last warning." Karen's head whipped toward Tom, her eyes wild. "You set me up!" she shrieked. "You knew I'd come for the Jeep!" Tom's expression didn't change. "You came on your own, Karen, like always." For a moment, time stood still. Karen's knuckles whitened on the steering wheel. The engine idled, its low rumble the only sound under the tension. Even the night air seemed to hush in anticipation. Officers tightened their formation. Hands hovered over holsters. Then finally, Karen let out a broken sigh. Her body sagged with defeat. She slowly raised her hands and opened the door. One foot touched the ground, followed by the other. Her eyes, rimmed with mascara and disbelief, darted from officer to officer, neighbor to neighbor. The shame, the horror of being on the wrong side of the law, her law, washed over her like cold water. The officers moved in quickly but gently, cuffing her hands behind her back. She didn't resist. She couldn't. Whatever sense of authority she thought she wielded had shattered under the weight of real law enforcement and public embarrassment. And as the door to the Jeep closed behind her, it was like a final punctuation mark on a story she had tried, and failed, to control. Tom stood silently as the scene unfolded. No gloating, no smug remarks. Just a slow, weary exhale. The adrenaline was fading now, leaving behind something heavier. Relief mixed with the strange sadness of watching someone self-destruct right in front of you. Detective Hargrove walked over, clapping a hand on Tom's shoulder. "She's lucky. We were already watching the Jeep. This could have ended way worse." Tom nodded. She never knew how close she was to real danger. Hargrove glanced toward the squad cars. Well, she knows now. As Karen was placed gently into the back of the cruiser, her face hidden from the flashing lights, the neighborhood watched in stunned silence. For years, she had lorded over them with fear and technicalities. But tonight, the Queen had fallen, and No one was coming to pick up the pieces. The flashing lights had finally dimmed, though the glow of what had just happened still hung heavy in the air. Karen was now in the back of a squad car, staring blankly ahead, lips pressed into a thin, stunned line. For the first time since she moved into the neighborhood, she had no audience, no clipboard, no say, just silence. Her reign of petty power ended not with a dramatic HOA meeting, but with cold steel cuffs and a long list of questions waiting at the precinct. Tom stood a few feet from the garage, hands on his hips, gazing at the Jeep like it was some long-lost relative that had narrowly escaped a hostage situation. The vehicle had been checked out by the officers, just to make sure Karen hadn't tampered with any evidence. Thankfully, she hadn't made it that far. A few scratches around the ignition and glove box, sure, but the Jeep had weathered worse. Still, the real damage wasn't physical. It was the violation, the idea that someone he had lived across from, waved to in passing, could take it upon themselves to invade his space so boldly. Detective Hargrove approached, flipping a small notebook closed. "Well, we've got everything we need for now. She'll be held for trespassing, attempted grand theft auto, and obstruction of a federal investigation. She'll probably try to talk her way out of it, but let's just say her HOA badge doesn't hold up in court." Tom chuckled softly, shaking his head. "You know, I always figured she'd go too far one day. I just didn't think it would be this far." The detective smiled wryly. "That's usually how it happens. They push boundaries until the boundaries push back." As the police vehicles began to pull away, Tom stood there for a moment longer, letting it all sink in. The night air was cooler now, the kind of cool that comes after a storm. He took a long breath in, then let it go slowly, the weight on his shoulders lifting inch by inch. Around him, the neighborhood began to settle back into itself. Porch lights flicked off, murmured conversations ended, and one by one, doors closed behind retreating neighbors, some of them probably still in disbelief at the whole spectacle. Tom looked at the garage, his garage, its busted lock hanging sadly from the door. That would need fixing, but it was a small price to pay, all things considered. His Jeep was safe. The operation he was helping with remained intact. And Karen? Well, she'd finally found a boundary she couldn't cross without consequences. As he made his way back inside, Tom allowed himself a small, tired smile. He didn't feel victorious exactly. There was no pleasure in watching someone self-destruct, even someone as irritating as Karen. But there was peace. And maybe, just maybe, a lesson buried somewhere in the wreckage. That calm, patience, and a little faith in the system could sometimes hold their own against even the most chaotic storms. He locked his front door, poured himself a glass of water, and sank into his favorite armchair. The adrenaline was still lingering, but fading, and as he took his first full sip of water since dinner, a thought crossed his mind. He hadn't raised his voice once tonight. He'd handled the chaos, the invasion, the standoff, with clarity, calmly, purposefully. That, in itself, felt like a quiet win. Outside, the neighborhood exhaled with him. The Queen of Chaos was gone. And for the first time in a long while, Tom felt like his home was finally his again. The sun rose slower than usual the next morning, or maybe it just felt that way to Tom. After a long night of statements, police chatter, and neighborhood whispers, the soft orange glow spilling through his kitchen window felt like a reset button had been hit on the whole block. He stirred his coffee thoughtfully, looking out at the quiet cul-de-sac. For once, it truly felt peaceful. No buzzing of Karen's walkie-talkie patrols, no laminated violation notices tucked into mailboxes. Just stillness and the gentle rustle of a new day. Tom stepped out onto his porch, mug in hand, and spotted a few neighbors doing the same. Normally, they might nod and go about their routines. But today, one by one, they turned toward him, smiling, waving, some even clapping lightly, as if a silent understanding had passed between them overnight. One of them, Roger from 2 houses down, raised a thermos and called out, "You're a legend, Tom! Tom laughed, modestly waving it off. Just protected my garage, that's all. But he knew it wasn't just that. What had happened was bigger than a car theft or a garage lock. It had peeled back the mask on the kind of control and entitlement that had made so many people here walk on eggshells for far too long. Karen had taken things to a level no one expected, and now that she'd been stopped, a subtle weight had lifted from the entire neighborhood. Sitting back on a porch chair, Tom let his thoughts drift. He didn't consider himself a hero. He was just a guy with a beat-up Jeep, a stubborn streak, and a low tolerance for nonsense. But what he had learned was the value of staying composed under pressure. There were so many moments where he could have snapped. When he discovered the cut lock, when Karen tried to literally drive off in his vehicle, but keeping his head had not only helped catch her in the act, it had kept a federal investigation intact. And maybe, most satisfying of all, the very thing Karen tried to weaponize against. Him, her obsessive fixation on rules and control, had become her downfall. Her assumption that she could get away with anything had blinded her to the fact that the Jeep wasn't just a flashy vehicle. It was a bait car tied into a larger criminal surveillance operation. She couldn't have picked a worse car to mess with, and Tom had to admit there was poetic justice in that. Word around the neighborhood was that Karen wouldn't be returning anytime soon. Rumor had it she was released on bail, but under strict conditions, no contact with any HOA matters, and certainly no proximity to Tom's property. One particularly gleeful neighbor even swore they saw her house listed for sale the next day, with the sign leaning a little crooked, almost as if karma had a hand in it. Tom took a final sip of his coffee and grinned. The Jeep was back in the garage, now under upgraded surveillance, just in case. He'd also replaced the old lock with a smart system, which sent a chime to his phone every time it was opened. "Fool me once," he murmured with a smirk. But beyond all that, what stuck with him most was how the chaos had actually brought the community closer together. People who used to silently nod at HOA memos were now openly talking about reforming it, maybe even voting in a new board altogether. Neighbors who once kept to themselves were sharing stories, laughter, and baked goods, as if the whole experience had cracked the isolation wide open. One of the neighborhood kids biked by and shouted, "Nice save, Mr. Tom." "My dad says you should run the HOA." Tom nearly choked on his coffee. "Not a chance," he called back, laughing. Still, the thought lingered, maybe not as the next president of the HOA, but as someone who'd earned a little more respect, a little more say. He wouldn't mind using that voice to keep things grounded, fair, normal. As he headed inside, he paused to glance back at the street one more time. The sunlight had fully spilled in now, warming the sidewalks and driveways. Things weren't perfect, but they were getting better. And Tom? He'd be ready if another self-declared neighborhood enforcer decided to step out of line. Because if this whole ordeal had taught him anything, it was that standing your ground with calm resolve was more powerful than barking rules or breaking locks. And with that thought, Tom shut his front door behind him. The Jeep was safe, the garage secure, and the neighborhood finally breathing free. If you enjoyed this video and want to see the next part, let me know in the comments. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to stay updated. See you in the next one. Your support means the world.